Hey everyone, I hope you're well. I wanted to provide you with a quick summary of the rule of life so that we can hit the ground running once you guys get here during our week together. Now, I know from a lot of your posts and reading your logs that many of you or all of you had to read the Rule of St. Benedict, and most of you read Macchia's Crafting a Rule of Life. So some of this may be a review for you. However, given how much you have digested and read recently, we thought it would not hurt to do a bit of review. And also we wanted to give you this video so that you can refer back to it for specific rules of life examples that I'm going to give. So if you can bear with me for 1 second, I am still learning how to do all of these different things on Zoom. So I'm hoping that you can see that. So we are going to talk here about crafting a rule of life, and we'll get to do some more of this work in our week together, and then you will ultimately get to do a lot of this work in your time creating your project for this second year. So in her book, Sacred Rhythms, Ruth Haley Barton says that a rule of life tries to answer 2 questions. Who do I want to be, and how do I want to live? And actually, it might be more accurate to say that a rule of life seeks to address the interplay between these 2 questions. How do I want to live so I can be who I want to be? Our desire is to live intentionally, and many of you in your posts talked a lot about wanting to be more intentional. So we desire our lives to be intentional into who God is calling us to be as people, leaders, children of God, all of those different roles that we play. A good rule will take our calling into account and provide the capacity for us to be sustained personally, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, physically, all of it in our call and for the sake of our calling. One particular aspect of your calling that you are all seeking to lean into in this season is to be a leader of change. So we will be asking you in your final paper for this year to create rules of life to support this God-given calling. In Todd's words in Tempered Resilience, we are creating a plan for resilience. This will come through a rhythm of leading and of not leading in ways that will help you to endure. These are, again, in Todd's words, guideposts to stay calm, stay connected, and stay the course in your calling. So just a bit of history on the rule of life. Again, many of you read the Rule of St. Benedict. As we know, this was the rule of life was named after the work of St. Benedict, who lived in the 1st century. St. Benedict had founded 12 monastic communities. The orders were named after him, and he wrote this Rule of St. Benedict. And really, it's a guidebook to organize a monastic order with periods of communal and private prayer, spiritual reading, manual labor, and sleep. All of that is covered in these rules. In a sense, it's a guidebook for how to live in a monastic community with order and with discipline. And these rules became one of the most influential rules in Western Christendom. Charlemagne urged monasteries to adopt this particular kind of rule. It was so widely used all throughout the Middle Ages. And I think what's an interesting note to note when we talk about the origin of the rule of life is that it was based in Benedict's commitment towards humility, and how Benedict expressed that was both in contemplation, a life of prayer, and community, a life of love. So again, and many of you noted this in your posts, that we can get very individualistic about our rules of life, but knowing that it was actually grounded in this very communal sense of what it meant to live out the words of Jesus, hopefully gives us some helpful context. And we still see rules of life in Catholic orders and in monasteries today, and we've actually even seen it emerging right in some of our mainline and evangelical churches. Okay, so rule of life as a guide. Now, I don't know if some of you maybe have reacted to the words rule or discipline and some of those things as we engage with how to think about spiritual practices. But as I've seen in many of your posts, many of you have already taken on rules of life. And so this is an engagement that is familiar to you. So everyone belongs in this conversation. So the term rule of life could connotate negative baggage. It can sound like legalism or something you do in your religion. But this is actually the opposite of what we are hoping to do in this particular assignment. So a quick Latin lesson. There are two Latin words for rule, lex and regula. I'm probably not saying that right. When we say rule, we are talking about the second definition, not necessarily law, but a rule or a guide. We are not talking about making a new law that's going to produce guilt or shame, but rather a guide that helps us grow into the people that God has called us to be. Many of you maybe have used this metaphor before of a trellis and a grapevine. This becomes really helpful when talking about the rule of life. And well, because I particularly love wine, so I like the metaphor as well. The trellis isn't necessarily a structure that produces its own fruit. It is a necessary structure to help plants grow and produce their own fruit. In the same way, rule of life gives structure, it gives direction, it gives intentionality to our lives, but itself doesn't make things grow. These rules or these trellises create spaces and rhythms for us to be transformed by God's Spirit. So our rules of life, and we'll talk specifically about how to construct one in a second, but our rules of life contain disciplines and practices that shape and support our call. So if a rule of life is a trellis, our vocation then becomes the blueprints to help us build this. And what are the practices? The question we ask is, what are the practices that will enable you to faithfully embody and sustain God's call on your life? And specifically in this season, what is the call on your life? Our vocational calling should help us decide what practices that we are choosing to embody, just as these practices also form us to be fit for the vocation that God has invited us into. So just a biblical example of rule of life, and there's many of them that we could look at, but just for sake of time, I'll just look at the calling of the disciples. Matthew 4, as we know, Jesus calling the disciples. And notice when Jesus calls the disciples, they were already embodying a rule of life based on their vocation. Fishermen, what were they doing? They were throwing their nets into the sea. They were catching fish. They were repairing the nets. Their disciplines, their practices fit their vocation. And then Jesus steps in and gives them a new call to fish for people. Now, they don't really know what this means, as we know, but they figure it out over time as they follow Jesus. But what we do know is that they reoriented their embodied practices to follow Jesus. They left their nets. And instead, Jesus instructs them on their new practices, which they come to embody over time, proclaiming that the kingdom of heaven is near. They are to cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons, stay with those who welcome you and grant them peace. And if a town does not welcome you, shake the dust off your sandals and leave. When you receive persecution, flee to another town. So these are all practices and disciplines that Jesus is giving so that the disciples can live into this calling. So let's get into the nitty-gritty just a little bit in this last portion. And again, we'll be giving you time to think through some of the specifics this week and then into when you start writing for your final project. But just to kind of prime you right here, what are important elements of a personal rule of life? Of course, we're talking about openness to the grace of God's Spirit. Again, these are guideposts. We're listening to the Spirit guide us, not into rules that will squelch the Spirit, but rules that will allow growth, freedom, newness. Openness to accountability from others and from God. Recognizes the importance of habit. Some people frame their rules of life with daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, or seasonally rhythms. And one of the things that Todd and I would emphasize is that these rules of all of yours are going to look very different. There isn't one particular template. And if you looked at Makia's book, he has a very specific template to follow. But that doesn't work for some. And so we're hoping that this both fits the vocation that you're called into, but also works for who you are and brings you into that freedom. Our aims for life, for love of God and others, and it tends to how we are investing our life. What are we putting our time, our money, our energies into, and how do we aim that in a way that serves God and others? And again, I just want to highlight, many of you are already living into rules of life in your season. You've thought through this before. And so this might be an opportunity for you to go back and look at them again and ask in this season, what are the rules of life that would best sustain and nurture me as I live out this calling? What are some possible elements of the rule of life? You could think about vows. You could think about particular values. You could think about your particular regular schedule. Maybe there's divine office, I do pray as you go, there's meals with others, special allowances for yourself when you're sick or overly tired. What will you do when you hit that point where you know you're overly sick or tired? Maybe it's a specific attitude, and then of course, specific practices and disciplines. How do you construct your rule? Spend some time in prayer, ask God to help you listen and discern your rule of life. Think through some elements, think through some exercises and disciplines, how often you'd want to do those. I'd encourage you to look through some other rules of life that that we will give you and that maybe you know from other people. That often helps spur some ideas for me, some things I hadn't thought through or hadn't thought fully through until I considered how other people are faithfully embodying their practices. So here are just a few examples. Again, this does not need to be yours, but maybe this will help you think a bit more about what you'd like to do. One person decided to just do daily practices and weekly practices. So I'll let you kind of look through that. I thought it was interesting. This person focused on an hour with the phone off and also curating media consumption to 4 hours a week. And of course, there's apps that we can have for that as well. So that's one example. A second example. Okay, this is mine, but it was from a long time ago, and I'm seeing that I need to now update my own rule of life because I no longer have housemates. However, this is another way to think about it. I just broke it down into different categories: worship, time with people, my workouts, times for reflection and learning, Sabbath, a retreat, and tithing. This is actually just kind of a fun one. So one of my former professors, Dr. John Goldengay, had this rule of life. One is based on the Old Testament on this slide, and the next one is the New Testament. And it's much more, if you would think of probably in terms of values rather than particular practices that you would see in some of these other ones. But I did think it was an interesting way to go about it. He based his rule of life on some Old Testament here. And so he talks about growing things to eat. I like this one: keeping out of department stores and shopping malls. And I would say probably internet as well. And then don't forget on Friday, think about the fact that you're going to die. It's so typical Dr. John Goldengay, if you know him. But then he also has times of communal space, talking with friends, holding week-long holidays with friends to celebrate what God has done for us in nature and in delivering us. And then here is Dr. Goldengay's New Testament sample rule of life. And again, he is thinking holistically. He's thinking about our sexual life, our life with parents and children, our balance of work and rest, and our truth telling and generosity. So again, these may be launching points for you to think about your rules of life, if that can be helpful. Just a couple others here. This one was from a former professor at Fuller, Angela Gorel, and she specifically was talking about the practice of honoring her body and the practices of rhythms and rest. As you can see here, she chose to participate in a monthly retreat in Carpinteria, which is this beautiful beach town outside of LA. I should do this. This is a great idea. During the day, she will engage in Lectio and journaling when she's there in Carpinteria. And she talks about also journaling about what God has been teaching her about the last month, writing down questions, confusing thoughts, affirmations, etc. And then she will practice guidance by meeting each month later that same day. So she plans it all out on the same day with a spiritual director. And then she journals and reflects on Lectio Divina with the director. So this is maybe a little bit more of a narrow rule of life, as it's talking about honoring your body and practices of rhythms and rest. But again, I wanted to give you a sample ideas so that you might draw from these. And then finally, I thought this was a really interesting one, Martin Luther King Jr.'s rule of life. So meditating daily on teachings of life of Jesus, remember to seek justice and reconciliation, not victory, walk and talk in the manner of love, praying, sacrificing, refraining from violence. So you can see, and I think this is a really great example for us to see that Martin Luther King Jr.'s rule of life really was aimed and oriented towards the calling, the nonviolent action, walking in justice and reconciliation, the calling that he had received from God, that his practices were aimed in that direction. So that is all for now. It's just a little overview for you to get you ready for us to talk together during your week here. So looking forward to seeing you all, and take care. Talk to you soon.